Hey everyone, it's Jana from The Last Stitch. Sewing can take up quite a lot of time, that is true, but the good news is that there are some really excellent time-saving techniques that will also help you to make less mistakes. Sounds too good to be true? Well, it's not. So in today's video, I want to share with you my 9 favorite time-saving techniques, and the best part is that they're also absolutely stress-free. So without further ado, let's start with tip number 1. Now, one big time waster when it comes to sewing is to localize things, especially as once you get started sewing, it can become really messy really fast. So what I like to do is to organize my tools and notions before I start sewing. So what I actually do, very simple, I just put these things like thread, winded bobbins, the needles I plan to use, some other smaller notions, I just put them in this little metal old candy basket. It's very, very simple. If you have more larger tools, I use a separate box for that as well, just to make sure that it's very neatly organized. And this little trick can actually make a big difference, especially once you get sewing for a bit. You know how all of a sudden you're in this mountain of fabrics and paper and cut threads, just a big mess. And talk about trying to find a needle in a haystack. Well, if you are diligent about putting all the stuff that you are not using right now back in this little box, you will not have these issues. And speaking of organization, another tip that I highly recommend is to use some type of method to keep track of the pattern pieces. So for instance, sometimes it can be hard if you have 2 pattern pieces that are very similar. For instance, if you have an upper collar and an under collar, they are separate pattern pieces, but they look so similar. So if you don't mark those initially, you have to go and locate the original pattern and measure and stuff like that, and you get really nervous. Did I do it right? You waste so much time and energy trying to figure that out. Well, it's an easy fix by using what I'm holding in my hand, which is freezer tape. This is what you put on plastic boxes to label what food is in when you put it in the freezer. It's very similar to masking tape, and I know some people use masking tape instead. Another option is, of course, perhaps using those what I call a washer tape, any kind of tape that has a glue that will not leave any trace on the fabric. That's what you're opting for. So what I do, I just use this tape, and for instance, if I want to label the undercollar, I just perhaps write under like this on the pencil. So there you go, under. And then I just put that on the fabric piece or the cut piece. Super easy. Another great way of using this type of labeling system is when you are dealing with fabrics that do have a right side and a wrong side, but it's really hard to tell which is which. Especially, I can give you an example. If you are sewing dark jersey fabric. Now, jersey fabric has a right side and a wrong side, but if the fabric is dark and the light in your sewing space isn't that great, well, it can be really difficult to tell the difference. So what you should do then, when you're cutting, as soon as you're cutting the fabric out, the piece is done, you just, again, use your tape, put an R for right side, you put it on the fabric, and then you're done. Super easy, and it will just save so much time and grievance later on, I can assure you that. And why not use chalk, you may ask? Well, the problem with chalk is the fact that on many fabrics, it tends to disappear when you're working with the pieces. So you'd always run a risk, and especially on those slippery fabric, that once you need to figure out which piece is which, then the chalk is pretty much gone. So that is why I prefer using the tape method. Another option is to use a sliver of regular white soap and do like a cross or write an R or something like that on the fabric. That will also stay put longer. And I actually share that tip in another video, which I highly recommend, where I show my best tips for sewing with knits. So you can try that out as well. There are of course many other options as well. Please share in the comment section, but finding some type of label system that doesn't ruin the fabric is easy to remove and will not disappear when you're working with it. Those should be the guides when it comes to using this label system. Now, another challenge when it comes to organizing things is how to keep track of all the pattern pieces once you start sewing, especially the smaller ones. So what I like to do, as soon as I've cut all the pieces, I like to pin them either on an ironing board which is really helpful, especially in the beginning if you're not doing much pressing. I just pin the pieces together, like the sleeves together, the bodice pieces, the collar pieces, whatever piece I'm sewing. I pin them together in a pairing on the ironing board. If you have a dress dummy, even better. I like to place them on my dress dummy, so then you can of course have easy access to your ironing board. Both these methods are really, really easy, and the benefit is of course because you're just using a pin and you're placing it on top of the object, that it also makes it very easy to move back and forth. So that is also a method I really recommend when it comes to having that smooth workflow, right, where you don't have to shift through things. You just pin them on something, remove them when you need it, and then you pin it back again until you need them the next time. Easy peasy. Now my next tip is so simple that I feel a little bit embarrassing even showing it, but it actually is a big help, and that is to wind 2 bobbins with the same color of thread before you start sewing. Now it saves time in 2 ways. First of all, you don't have to re-thread the machine halfway through when you run out of bobbin thread, because a lot of projects will actually require more than 1 bobbin in my experience, especially if you do a lot of sewing on your regular sewing machine. The second reason why I do recommend having 2 bobbins is if you're sewing a long sequence, especially top stitching, and you're a little bit unsure if the bobbin thread that you have will last the entire sequence. You don't want to run the risk of having to redo everything because you run out of bobbin thread mid-through. It's such an annoyance, right? So in those cases when you're a little bit unsure, it's definitely much easier if you already have the winded thread. You don't have to re-thread your machine, everything. You just replace the bobbin with a fresh one and you can be assured that the thread will last all the way through. So very simple tip, but actually a really also effective tip. Sometimes you have to do a little bit more work up front to save time later on. And a great example of this is making samples. So when I sew, I always now make samples using the fabric I tend to use, the stitches I plan to use, and then I check for things such as stitch length, tension settings, if I'm using stretch fabric, you know, stretchability, stretch properties like this, for instance, just to make sure that it actually is the way I have intended it to. And that can save so much time later on. So once you've figured out those settings, you will have an easy breeze later on, no ripping, no nothing. I also recommend using samples if you're using fusible interfacing. Again, do a sample just to make sure that the interfacing and the fabric looks good together. If you use interfacing stretch fabric, that it stretches without breaking. All that stuff is so important. So that is why I highly recommend that before you start sewing, you put in those extra minutes just to test things out to make sure that you will not be disappointed later on. If you have found a setting that you really like, for instance for top stitching, if you're happy with the stitch length and the tension settings, why not write them down either in a physical notebook or use a computer document? There are many ways of doing that, and I would love to hear your favorite ways of documenting your settings, because especially if you're going back and forth and you have to re-thread your machine for doing different things. For instance, when you're sewing jeans, you will have to go between top stitching settings and regular seam settings. If you have those settings easy to access, you will not have to do samples again and again, right? Because you've only done it once in the beginning, and then you just use your notes to make sure that you're on track and you don't have to do everything over and over again. And of course that will also help you save time if you're doing a similar project again. So having those settings written down and what type of fabric you're using, if you're using a serger, of course differential feed settings, tension setting, perhaps pressure foot pressure settings, all those things will be absolutely super valuable if you're doing a similar project later on, because you don't have to start from scratch, right? Because you already have so many things figured out. So I highly recommend that you use some type of note system for your sewing. Now we've talked so much about prep work, but I guess you're curious now about what about sewing? How can I make the sewing faster? Well, now I'm going to share some really great tips for that too. And one thing you can try is chain piecing. Now, chain piecing is like an industrial inspired method where you're actually inserting pieces after pieces after pieces without stopping and cutting the thread. So for instance, if you're top stitching an opening of a pocket, then you stitch the entire pocket for the first one, then you just secure the stitch by going a little bit back and forth. Then just insert the next piece without cutting the thread, without removing the first piece, and then you stitch over that one as well. And you repeat that process for any type of object that has the similar type of sewing. This is, for instance, excellent when you're sewing jeans. You can save so much time by using this chain piecing method. You can also actually use it when you're interfacing. I like to place several pieces that I'm interfacing. You know, if they have the same strip, I just place the pieces next to each other and I have one long strip, and I iron over that, and then I just cut into separate pieces. And if you have a serger, this system is even easier because serger can leave a chain of threads. So you just sew the first piece, then you stitch a chain, and then you insert the next piece, you stitch a chain, insert the next piece, so forth and so forth. And then once you're done stitching together all the pieces, then you cut it up. So for instance, I highly recommend that if you're sewing shoulder seams, for instance, on a garment, using a serger, you just stitch the first shoulder seam, leave a chain, and then you insert and you sew the second shoulder. Easy peasy again. And then another great way of saving time is to sew in batches. And what that means is that you sew everything that requires the same type of settings and thread at the same time. Again, an excellent method to use when you're sewing jeans. And if you head over to my website, thelaststitch.com, you will see some great examples there on how you can batch sew. And another way where batch sewing is super helpful is when you are maybe doing 2 to 3 garments at the same time. You can of course install the neckline just as one sequence, and then you move on to the sleeves, etc., etc. So batch sewing can actually save a lot of time. It can be, I find, a little bit boring if I do that too much, but as I said, as a principle, batch sewing is super helpful. And if you have any great tips how to batch sew, please share in the comment section. And another tip to save time when it comes to sewing is to skip overcasting. Now, I say that with a big caveat, right? Because of course you need to overcast a lot of edges to keep them from fraying, but if the seam is being enclosed, and what I mean by enclosed is that it's 100% covered. So a good example for that would be a waistband on a pair of trousers on a skirt, and another example would be a placket on a shirt. A third example would be a collar on a shirt. All these things, when you fold in the edges of the fabric and then you stitch over to secure them, you will actually don't have to worry about fraying in 99% of cases. Now there are of course some exceptions to this rule, but you will probably notice those fabrics. Those are the ones that starts to disintegrate just before they leave the cutting table. Keep those overcasted. I do recommend that. But on regular type of woven fabrics, and of course with knit fabric you don't have to overcast at all, skipping those is absolutely risk-free and will save you quite a bit of time. So that's also a tip that I highly recommend to save time when you're sewing. So these were my 9 favorite time sewing tips. And of course there are so many more, which is why I also would love to know your favorites. And so share them in the comment section so we can learn from each other and figure out ways to optimizing our sewing workflow while also making less mistakes. Thank you so much for watching, and of course check out my other videos on workflow and optimizing sewing. Links will of course be in the description section. Thank you so much for watching. Stitch safe. Bye bye.